Hello friends, and welcome to the stream. Can everyone hear me? Am I coming out of the right microphone? Hey, thank you for those early birthday wishes. Nice. Good to have you here, everyone. So, welcome along. Welcome to the live stream. If it's your first time on the stream, double special welcome to you. Those of you who've been here before will know that we'd like to start with a little bit of candlelight. Alright. Nice. So, tonight's stream is a little different. We are not going to go through the comments and the feedback from the last episode just yet. Hey, nice. Feeling chill? We're not going to go through those comments and feedback and fan art and so on tonight. I'm going to save that for probably a couple of weeks' time when the episode's had a bit more time to be out there and percolate. I have some big thoughts on it, which will be cool to get to. So instead, so the reason the stream came about is because friend of the show, The Things, and friend of the show, my mum, had things to say about Jordan Peterson and the 12 Rules for Life. So The Things got in touch and said, I've heard that, like, I gather that philosophically Peterson's not like really robust, but like, is the book still worth getting like as a self-help book? And I told my mum I'm reading this book by this guy. It's like self-help for Tories, and she was like, "How can a self-help book be politically like one way or the other?" And I was like, "Okay, cool, interesting question." And I also met a bunch of people who I was really surprised were into Jordan Peterson. A guy in my year at drama school, actually, Lance, he was like, "Oh yeah, I love him," and I was like, "Really? Like, he's really Tory?" And he was like, "Well, I don't get it. Like, what do you mean?" So I thought it'd be cool to just kind of go through the book, like very light. We'll kind of skim it. Just like pretty chill. It's not like a review per se, but we'll just sort of go through it point by point, and I'll expand on some stuff I said in the video. So I should say up front that if you're thinking about super chatting tonight, I'm probably going to be focusing mainly on the book. So you're obviously very welcome to super chat, but I will probably have my eyes on this most of the time and probably won't be shouting them out as I usually like to do. So I guess, and I'll keep one eye on the chat, but probably most of the time I'll just be talking about the book. So I guess we may as well get into it. I've got my copy of the book. I've got my my Jeff Goldblum Chaos shirt. So maybe, actually, if this is blue and red, why don't we can make it slightly more red in here. That's not right, is it? Hey, there it is. Alright, that's cool. Like, maybe it's a little too red. Turn it down a little. How's that? Cool. Am I still going to be able to read the pages in it like this? Hope so. Okie dokie. I should say as well, for those who didn't know what a Tory is. A Tory is I'll turn the music down a little bit. A Tory is somebody who's a member of the British Conservative Party, and obviously, literally speaking, Peterson isn't. But the reason I was surprised that a lot of sort of people that I knew were into him is because ideologically, he seems very Tory. It's like Tory without the policies. So we'll kind of get into that a little bit. But it's kind of in. So my mum asked me, like, how can a self-help book be politically one way or the other? And I was like, well, it's kind of in the choice of example and the choice of imagery as well. It's quite Tory, and the focus on individualism and the kind of taking every opportunity to bash socialism. It's pretty conservative. But anyway, we'll get into it. Maybe I'll just tilt you down a little bit so that you can See, I've got my copy here. We begin with the foreword to the book, which is written by a psychologist named Norman Doidge. And the foreword, I've got to say, the foreword had me riled up, because it's kind of weird. Like, if I had asked somebody to write a foreword that made the book look bad, that kind of made it seem dodge, this is like what I'd have written. Doidge, as I said in the video, Doidge presents Peterson's whole project as this counter to relativism. He's like, moral relativism is like really, really dangerous, and it's being taught to millennials all over the world, and Peterson is the answer to this. There's a bit here where he's like, he's definitely not right wing, and it's almost like the lady doth protest too much a little bit, maybe. So Doidge thinks that moral relativism is a big problem. He's like, all these moral relativists, they're corrupting the youth. He doesn't cite anybody, which is interesting. He's like, all these moral relativist thinkers, and I'm like, okay, like who? I mean, I get it's just a foreword. You don't want like full academic citations, but like, who specifically? There's a sorry, there might be a little bit of... Oh yeah, here we go. He says, scratch the most clever postmodern relativist professor's Mercedes with a key, and you'll see how fast the mask of relativism and the cloak of radical tolerance comes off. And I've written in the margins, who is this professor? Who specifically are you talking about? He cites Aristotle as somebody who was apparently like somebody who had moral standards and thought about it and did it good, but he doesn't cite any moral relativists. And this is a problem that I found when I was researching the show with Molyneux and with Sam Harris as well. Sam Harris at one point in that TED Talk I showed a clip of says, most Western intellectuals would compare Ted Bundy with the Dalai Lama and say there's nothing really for them to be right or wrong about. And I was like, well, who? And there was going to be a line where I was like, most Western intellectuals are down here in hell, Sam. Do you want to talk to anyone in particular? Like, so citations, a little thin on the ground from Norman Doidge. Was curious to hear a little bit more about that. But okay, fair enough. It's just a foreword, so not a huge deal. There was another point I wanted to make about the foreword as well. Oh yeah. So Doidge conflates moral relativism, the kind of philosophical position, with a position of infinite tolerance. He's like, people say that you should just tolerate anything, absolutely anything, and like that's internally inconsistent because nobody really believes that. Yeah, he's just like, people are too tolerant. Like people are like tolerance. The emphasis on tolerance is so paramount that for many people, one of the worst character flaws a person can have is to be judgmental. And it's like, who says that though? Who's saying that? Specifically, who? Is there anyone who is really saying that we should be infinitely tolerant? Of anything? Is anyone actually saying that? Or have you made that up? And if so, who? And Doidge says, if you're just a full-on moral relativist, and every goal is as good as every other, then you fall into nihilism and despair, and hence Peterson is your man. He's your boy. He's the one you want to go to. Yeah, so that's Doidge's foreword. He frames the book very much as postmodern leftists and moral relativists have led you astray, and this book will be the answer. So okay, big words. Doidge has really bigged it up from the first chapter. I was like, oh, here we go. We're going to be into some real hardcore, like mental shit's going to be happening. But oh hey, apparently Harry's in the chat as well. Hey buddy. Hey. Good to have you in the chat, man. Good to have you here, buddy. Yeah, we're basically just going through 12 Rules for Life. It's not going to be hugely exciting, but we'll find a way to make it entertaining. Let me just turn you here so you can see things a little better. So from the forward, Doidge is building it up. He's like, Peterson's your man. He's got the answer. He's your boy. If you're a moral relativist, this will sort you right out. And then we get into Peterson's introduction, which he has called the Overture. Nice, very, very arty. And what I liked, and Harry, you'll like this, is he tells us a little bit about how he started his career. He started answering people's questions on Quora, like a questions website. So he got his start posting he was like from the womb. He was posting. He came out posting. Right? So he's and I was like, oh wow, like I started my career as whatever it is that I am, posting random shit online as well, and that's where he started. And he got really popular answering people's questions on Quora. And then he made some YouTube videos, which really blew up, and and then he says, I became embroiled in a political controversy that drew an inordinate amount of attention. That's another story, maybe even another book. I've filled that gap in. What Peterson doesn't tell you is that he initially became quite popular not only for his YouTube videos and his Quora answers, but because he advised the Canadian Parliament not to extend human rights legislation to trans people based on a misreading of Bill C-16. That's what he doesn't, for some reason, doesn't specify that here. But yeah, and then he talks about his first book, Maps of Meaning, which we'll kind of get into a little bit. We get our first tentative explanation of order and chaos, which I talked about a bit in the video and which we'll come back to. He also hints that order has historically symbolically been portrayed as masculine, and chaos historically symbolically portrayed as feminine, like Eve, introducing chaos and the unknown into the world, or Pandora. That's another one that I came up with. And I've written in the margins here, do you wonder why they are presented that way, or are you just going to reproduce those presentations? So something that Peterson does is he says things like, order has historically been associated with the masculine, but then there's no like questioning of why that is, maybe. Like Simone de Beauvoir, for instance, I've got a copy of Le Deuxième Sexe down there, would talk about why that is. And he doesn't really get into that at any point, really. There's a lot of kind of saying this is the way it is and not really thinking about, okay, but why? Does it have to be that way? Again, that's the theme that we'll return to. I've highlighted a quote here that says, I've always thought if people really noticed what I was teaching, there would be hell to pay. And I've written, as you wish. So this is the moment where I started to get the idea to do the video in character as the devil, the personification of chaos, and the serpent. There's a lot of stuff about serpents later on. Doobly-doobly-doo. Yeah, as I say, we'll skim over this fairly lightly. He talks a little bit about maps of meaning. Then he talks extensively about a dream he had that led him to believe that the individual was kind of the core of the universe, and you have to focus on the individual. And I've written, is this just Julius Evola for Tories based on a dream you had? And when you say it like that, when you say that like this guy's worldview is largely based on a dream he had, it sounds bad. But I'm not really doing it justice. He does have more. It's kind of obviously something that's very important to him. But it's just the introduction anyway, and he gives us a little bit of the breakdown of order and chaos, and talks a little bit about I suppose the dream is about like why this means so much to him. I'm conscious that I probably will going through this will present it quite negatively by virtue of the fact that I will keep hitting on things that stood out to me as being curious or weird. But there were bits that I genuinely enjoyed and that I liked, and I hope that I'll be able to kind of touch on those as well, and I'll kind of bring them up when I get to them. So I'm keeping one eye on the chat, and I know people are like, yeah, like Duncan, like whoa, like absolutely go in on him, and I'm not trying to do that. Like I wanna try and give sort of a quick overview and quick thoughts, but highlight the good stuff as well, of which there is a little bit. So then we start with rule 1 of the 12. Rule 1 is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And as with all the rules, like if you just interpret that literally, then it sounds very weird. But of course, he thinks there's like a deeper meaning to it all. So we have a whistle stop through tour through evolution. And here Peterson begins talking about hierarchy, which he will return to later on. But he introduces the idea of hierarchy. Like there's hierarchy in nature. He thinks that hierarchy is essential, and that by mastering standing up straight with your shoulders back and all that entails psychologically, transformatively, you will be able to master your own position within the hierarchy. Okay, that's harsh. The curiosity that I have about this chapter is that he says, hierarchy, it's deeply ingrained to us, deeply psychologically ingrained, the idea of hierarchy and the idea of, people being up higher in status than you or lower status than you. And I can kind of appreciate that. So one of the techniques that I was once taught to do an improv scene is if you're ever asked to improvise a scene with somebody, then that's quite a lot. That's quite difficult. You need to come up with backstory and everything. And somebody told me, no, all you need to do is pick a number between 1 and 10, and that's your status. If you status 10, boom, go in. That's you totally immune to everything. Status 1, everything affects you hugely. So yeah, he's saying status is important to people. Okay, fair enough, cool. The curiosity I have is that he doesn't seem to be curious about which hierarchies are natural and fixed and which are maybe contingent. So he's saying, hey, look at lobsters, like, they've got a built-in hierarchy. Big lobsters eat the little ones or whatever. Or the big ones do very well, get all the mates, little ones not so much. And it's like, okay, cool. But, like, class hierarchy, not lobsters. Class hierarchy, contingent. Doesn't have to be that way. Not a feature of the natural world. Like, and he doesn't seem to be interested in that. He doesn't seem to be curious about, like, which hierarchies are maybe fixed and we can't do away with, and which ones actually maybe we can think our way out of. Doesn't seem to be so curious about that, so fair enough. There's a whole that happens a lot. Wait, there was one other bit that I wanted to. There's some language that sounds a little bit kind of red pilly, like, you know, mating and mating strategies in the sexual market and so on. But okay. Oh yeah, there's a bit we get to here. We're 12 pages in. There's a bit we get to where he spends like 2 or 3 pages on an idea that can be summarized in a couple of sentences. He says, you know, organisms evolve to suit their environment, but as they populate, they also have effects on their environment, which changes the selection pressures on them. So there's like a feedback loop between organisms and their environment that affects their evolution. Okay, that's the idea. He expresses that over 2 or 3 pages, and it's a little waffly and it's a little verbose. But at this stage, chapter 1, it's clear that Peterson enjoys language and he enjoys writing and he enjoys playing with words. And I actually, in the first few chapters, I found that quite charming because I do that too, and I like it. So at this stage, I've written like at the top, I'm like, so okay, you could have done this faster, but it's clear that you're kind of enjoying it, you know, and that actually makes it actually quite entertaining to read, because it's clear that he's like enjoying going on this little journey with you. Then there's kind of and this happens a fair bit, like something will just sort of come out of left field. It'll just like go past you really fast in the dark and you'll be like, whoa, what was that? At this point, there's a little diversion and we talk about environmentalists. And he says, eco-activists, idealistic in their viewpoint, envision nature as harmoniously balanced and perfect, absent the disruptions and depredations of mankind. And I was like, well, do environmentalists think that? Do they view that? Do environmentalists view nature as essentially harmonious and perfect without human beings, or do environmentalists view nature and the ecosystem as imperiled? Just a curiosity. He goes on. Unfortunately, the environment is also elephantitis and guinea worms, Anopheles mosquitoes and malaria, starvation-level droughts, AIDS, and the Black Plague. So he's talking about how, you know, order and chaos. There's chaos and order in everything. And I've written, it's interesting that you've chosen AIDS as an example, because although it is a naturally occurring disease, its effects were greatly needlessly greatly enhanced by human negligence and homophobia on the part of the Reagan government, among others. So interesting that you choose AIDS as an example of a natural disaster, when in fact, on another reading, it was made worse by negligence. But anyway, he goes on to say, the dominance hierarchy, however social or cultural it might appear, has been around for 500 million years. It's permanent, it's real. The dominance hierarchy is not capitalism or communism or the military-industrial complex or the patriarchy, which he then dismisses as not. He doesn't say it's not real, but he's quite dismissive of the idea of patriarchy, and we'll come back to that later. He says the dominance hierarchy, it's part of the world, it's part of the environment, it's total given. And again, the curiosity I have is, okay, cool, but does that mean that all hierarchies are like that? Or are there some that are maybe a little bit more malleable? He doesn't say. Oh yeah, here's just a little thing that stood out to me. He says, you know, if you're a big successful male lobster, you have preferential access to the best places to live and the highest quality food. People compete to do you favors. You have limitless opportunity for romantic and sexual contact. So if you're a male lobster, success is material advantage, best place to live, choice of mates, and other lobsters will be subservient to you. Good quality food. He then goes on to say, if you're a successful female lobster, you have access to many high quality suitors. And then describes that you will get the best suitors. So it's not a big thing, but it's just a little point that he characterizes success for men as material advantage, and success for women is access to men. Just curious about that. There's some more red pill language here about describing women as being out of 10. Here's a point that he makes, but I want to save that for later and come back to that. There's some more. There's a lot of individualism. There's a lot of like, if you can master yourself, you move up the dominance hierarchy. And individualism and focusing on the individual is a theme that we'll come back to. And I've written at the top here that maybe, in fairness, maybe that reflects not necessarily any political leanings, but maybe that reflects Peterson's experience as a clinical psychologist, where you have to treat what's in front of you. Basically, you can't treat society; you've got to treat the patient, who is just an individual. So maybe the individualistic approach reflects that more than anything else. I'm trying to be, I'm trying to be positive and be even-handed here as much as I can. There's an interesting bit here when he says people can get caught in destructive feedback loops with their environment. So we had feedback loops earlier on, and now in the kind of natural feedback loops. Now he's talking about feedback loops sort of psychologically. And he says sometimes we call things like that mental illness, even though it's not just going on inside their heads, which I thought was quite an interesting point to hear him acknowledge. Reminded me of Mark Fisher a little bit. There's some interesting stuff here. I've written at the bottom, this is actually pretty interesting, about people getting caught in feedbacks of anxiety. If you avoid something, you get anxious of it, you become more and more anxious. Hi, Zoe. Good to have you in the chat. So I quite like that. That was good. There's some interesting stuff here, too, about people learning that aggression is bad and then avoiding it and having to sort of relearn the idea that sometimes aggression is appropriate. So I guess here he's starting to be like, well, if you're telling people to be dominant lobsters, aren't they going to worry that, should I be aggressive or not? And he's saying, no, sometimes in the right situation, assertiveness, at least, can be important. And that's something that I had to learn as well. Going into drama school, I was like, had been very, very aggressive as an army cadet, really stamped that down at university, was a little bit timid, and then at drama school had to sort of learn to unlock those feelings in a constructive way, rather than a destructive one. So yeah, I thought that was all pretty interesting. That was cool. And I've written at the top here that although learning to use aggression, like appreciating that it's not always a bad thing and assertiveness can be good, I don't think he's really saying that you should like dig your heels in and be aggressive. But I can see how if somebody was a shithead, they would take that message from it. But I guess that's not entirely Peterson's fault. And then we have some interesting stuff about, if you do take the advice literally and stand up straight with your shoulders back, how things like power poses can change your mind and change the way you think and the way you move, which I agree with. That was again something we were taught at drama school, is moving the body to change the emotion and change the mind. So I think we've reached the end of chapter 1, and I've got my notes to chapter 1 that I've written here, and I've said the advice to move up the dominance hierarchy would obviously be of most use to people who are at the bottom of the societal hierarchy, right? Because, if you need to move up, the people who need to move up the most are the people at the bottom. And yet, Peterson's audience is mainly white young guys, which is even unusual within self-help circles, because the majority of people who buy self-help books are women. So I was like, I wonder why that is. I wonder if it has something to do with the naturalizing of class hierarchies, but I'm not sure. And I've written, he does take longer to say things than it needs to be, but at the same time, it's clear he's enjoying writing it, which is nice to see. And I'm not trying to be patronising there or anything. Like I genuinely, at this stage, was enjoying the language. So let's move on to chapter 2, which the rule for chapter 2 is treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. And this chapter starts with an absolutely fascinating question, which I think is a brilliant question to begin a psychological investigation with, which is, why do people who are on medication or being treated for illness take better care of their pets than they do of themselves? Why do some people not take their medication, but will take care of their cat or their dog? And I was like, ooh, that's actually a really interesting question. I wonder why that is. I wonder how many people do that. A fantastic question, brilliant place to start with. And I've even written, this is an interesting question. as we will see, it doesn't quite. We don't quite really get an answer to it. So here he's talking a little bit more about order and chaos, and about how they are, subjective features of subjective experience. He gives a lot of examples of chaos, and at the top I've written, these are all examples of chaos. What is it in itself? It's kind of, I felt very Socratic when I wrote that. And there's stuff about order and chaos and tyranny. I quoted that in the video. And again, I'm writing, what is order, what is chaos, are these modes of perception? And at the side here, I've hit on the big point that I made in the video, which is, if two people disagree on whether something is order or chaos, how can we tell who is correct? Can we? Or is it relative? So I think that's like a big unanswered question throughout Peterson's whole work, is like, well, are order and chaos subjective? Like, what are they? Because it seems like if they are, it seems like that poses big problems for the whole rest of his project, including the finding of meaning, which he says meaning is the balance between order and chaos, right? Well, if order and chaos are like, woo, then where's the meaning gone? So those are the main questions I have there. Here he kind of talks a little bit about what Jung would call archetypes. He thinks that I need to be careful here because I don't want people to say that you've misrepresented him, so I'm trying to be careful with my language. He says order and chaos are not understood first as things and then personified. He says they are understood as personalities. Order and chaos are understood as, for instance, male and female. And he says that categories like male and female and parent and child have been around, deeply embedded in people's minds for a long time. But the thing is, the categories of parent and child and male and female, the meanings of those concepts have changed so much and vary so much. What does it mean to say, for instance, that we have the same concept of parent and child as a caveman did? Like, would they really have had the same concept of gender as us? Like, if they've been around all this time, have they not changed? Do they not vary now? It's something he doesn't seem to be curious about. He just kind of seems to be projecting it back into the past, and I would have liked to hear a little bit more about how he's so certain about this. So he also says that these categories, I guess in Jungian language, archetypes, have evolved. They're very old. They're very valuable. They're very precious. They're contained within traditions and old and like the structure and the values of the state and so on, and they need to be held onto, and they're precious. But he doesn't consider the possibility that these categories, whatever they are, if they exist and however they exist, have been preserved and passed on because they're good at being copied rather than because they're useful. And this is something that happens with genes an awful lot. Like, a lot of the genes that we have aren't useful, they just happen to be good at getting copied. And he doesn't seem to be curious about extending that to ideas. He seems to be leaning towards saying, like, traditions and old categories and ideas and so on are very useful, but he doesn't really establish that they are useful. He just seems to be assuming that they are based on the fact that they are, in his opinion, very old and still around. So it's kind of like, if you write a book and it's a bestseller, then it must be good. It's like, not necessarily. or indeed, as he was saying at the start about his answers on Quora, if it fits with a lot of people's experience and a lot of people are moved by it, doesn't that mean that it's kind of useful and good? It's like, not really. No, it might just mean that it's catchy. Let me just change the music here. So anyway, the question we were on... Oh yeah, here's an absolutely genius bit at the bottom of page 42. We already know all this, but we don't know that we know it. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. You can apply that to anything. You can apply that to anything in the world. You all know that you like my videos. You just don't know that you know it. It's like, brilliant. But okay, we'll write that off as a rhetorical flourish. Be generous there. And in fairness, that's kind of it ties into what he was trying to do with maps and meanings. So anyway, we get some more stuff about chaos and order. Then we get a lot of theology. We get a lot of Bible stuff. We get a lot of Christianity. And the question we began with is, why do some people take better care of their animals than they do themselves? And it seems, after all of this Christianity stuff and all this stuff about like cruelty and good and evil, the answer he's provided to this question is people take better care of animals than they do of themselves because we are aware of ourselves as essentially fallen and spiritually lacking in the kind of quasi-Christian sense. Which, okay, if you're a Christian, then makes a lot of sense. If you're not, I'm not quite sold. Seems like there are some problems with that. And the solution to this is apparently to forgive yourself in a very religious way. Here, there's another one of those moments that just stands out and seems to come from nowhere. Hatred for the self and mankind must be balanced with gratefulness for tradition and the state. Kind of comes out of nowhere. Why those two? Not very Christ-like. Jesus wasn't somebody who was fond of either tradition or the state, so not sure why that is. So, okay, people take better care of their animals than they do themselves because they're aware of themselves as essentially spiritually fallen, and the solution is to... he doesn't say the solution is to be religious, but the solution is to forgive yourself in a very religious-sounding way. The thing is, that's not an answer to the question we started with. Why do people take better care of their animals than they do themselves? That's a hypothesis. The hypothesis, people take better care of their animals than they do themselves because they are aware of themselves as spiritually fallen. And then what you do is you take that and then you go and ask people, why didn't you take your pills? You do an experiment. You do a questionnaire or something, a survey. You ask them, do you have a pet? Yes. Do you take good care of it? Yes. Do you take care of yourself? No. Why do you think that is? So, and this is a theme that comes up again and again as Peterson says, this is the answer that makes sense within psychology as I understand it, but it has big empirical implications that he doesn't then follow up on. If people... So, he didn't talk to any patients, didn't talk to any people who don't take their meds. And also, another thing he doesn't seem to be curious about is this explanation that people don't take care of themselves because we are aware that we're essentially fallen is a rational explanation, and it might not have a rational answer, and he doesn't seem to consider that. I'm conscious that the stream's going to be really bloody long if we're only 2 rules in. Fortunately, Chapter 3 is a short one. Make friends with people who want the best for you, is the rule. It's fair. We get a lot of stuff about his early life. It's very parasocial. I'm trying not to spend too long on this without also not doing it justice. It kind of poses a pretty interesting challenge, which is, sometimes people say they want help, but what they really want is to kind of flounder in their own suffering and their own martyrdom. The idea that people can enjoy being suffering and that sometimes people put off trying to improve their situation because it's difficult. It's like, in my experience, I've met people like that. I've met people who, you want to help and you try and help, and then they don't really want you to help them. They just want to. Well, it seems like they just want to suffer. Misery loves company, as the old saying goes. So maybe there's a grain of truth in that. Although, when applied to the level of a society, I personally would say that's terrible advice. Generalizing it, I would say, is a recipe for, Toryism. Before you help someone, you should find out why that person is in trouble. You shouldn't merely assume that he or she is a noble victim of unjust circumstance and exploitation. It's far more likely that a given individual has just decided to reject the path upward because of its difficulty. And above that, I've written, how Christ-like. There's that famous bit of the Bible where somebody comes to Jesus asking to be healed, and he says, maybe it's your fault. Also, I think it's a little disingenuous to say that people are not succeeding and it's their own fault within systems in which not everyone can succeed. So, for instance, home ownership. Not everyone can succeed at that. If everybody owned a home, the housing market would collapse. The whole market, the idea of the whole market generally is built on the idea that some people have to go without. If everybody gets it guaranteed, then you can't have a market in it. So it seems a little bit disingenuous to say, maybe it's your fault. Maybe you need to consider, or maybe you need to consider that other people are where they are and it's their own fault. Within systems where actually not everyone can succeed and the system is built that way. Then we get to a passage which was slightly upsetting to me. It says, if I stay in an unhealthy relationship with you, perhaps it's because I'm too weak-willed and indecisive to leave, but I don't want to know it. Thus I continue helping you and console myself with my pointless martyrdom. It might just be a person trying to look good, pretending to solve what appears to be a difficult problem, instead of actually being good and addressing something real. So here Peterson's saying that if you seems to be saying that if you stay in an abusive relationship, it might be because you're too weak-willed, and you know, it's your own fault. And I have written something extremely rude about that, and that's all I'm going to say on that. So we are 3 rules down of a possible 12. How are we doing so far? Seems like we're doing all right in the chat. Ready to move on to rule number 4? So, rule number 4, bit of a change of pace. Actually quite good advice. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. Which, pretty good. There's some stuff in here which kind of comes out of nowhere philosophically, makes some pretty big assumptions. But then there's this really nice bit... nice bit where he says, when you internally criticize yourself, your internal critic will pick one arbitrary single domain of comparison, like fame or power, and then says, this is the only relevant thing. This person is more well-known than me. This person has more friends than me. That is the only thing that matters, and I am inferior in that regard. When actually, if you sort of took a step back and said, oh, there's lots of things that matter, you might be a little bit less harsh on yourself, which... is actually pretty interesting advice. There's also the advice that if you resent somebody for something, get curious about why that is. So really this chapter is just sort of encouraging emotional literacy, like get curious about why you feel the things you do. Just sort of think about, hi Nina, think about why you feel the things you do. Which, you know, not bad advice. At this point I've written, the verbosity is starting to get old now. I said in chapter 1 the playing with language and the fun was slightly charming. Here it's beginning to get a little old. I'm afraid. Yep, that's much the rest of chapter 4. We get this claim, even older than deeper than ethics is religion, and I've written citation needed. Here we have a really odd bit where Peterson says that there's no such thing as an atheist. He says nobody's really an atheist. You're not. You simply don't know what you believe before that. He says that you're simply not an atheist in your actions. And it's like, well, okay. Let's sort of take this at face value for a moment and say, okay, nobody's an atheist. Everybody secretly believes in God. But evidently some people believe it more than others. A Catholic evidently believes in God more than me, for instance. It kind of seems like you've moved the goalposts, and I'm not really understanding why. But yeah. Yeah, he says everybody believes in God, nobody's really an atheist, and doesn't really go much into that. Then we have some very odd claims. The Bible is, for better or worse, the foundational document of Western civilization, of Western values, Western morality, and Western conceptions of good and evil. Again, citation needed. And what the West as opposed to what? YouTubers much more talented than me have already explained how the West is a little bit of a problematic concept. And then we hear the Bible is the product of processes that remain fundamentally beyond our comprehension. And I've written what? No, it's not. In the margins, the story of how the Bible is made and the sources from which it was assembled and the various councils and people that decided the contents of it is absolutely comprehensible to humans. So I'm not quite sure what Peterson means by this. And that I'm not quite sure what you mean or in what way you mean it is a theme that we'll come back to. There's some stuff here about setting good goals for yourself and goals that you can measure and think about clearly, which, yeah, pretty good advice. There's a few pops at communism. Okay. So something I've written here in my notes on chapter 4 is some of this advice might be useful, thinking about whether the problem is really with you, whether you might approach things differently. But at what point do you stop doing that? At what point do you acknowledge, actually, the problem is with the world? Because it seems like this advice of, well, like, focus on yourself. Think about whether you're really approaching things the right way. It seems like you can keep doing that forever. And it seems like you could encourage somebody else to keep doing that forever rather than questioning society. So I'm like, It doesn't have any built-in endpoint. So at what point do you acknowledge that actually the world does have a problem? I've also written the first half of this was okay, but then it went off the rails with the Bible shit, which is a little harsh, but yeah, right. That's rule number 4. How are we doing? We're a third of the way through. If you've just joined us, we're not talking about the last episode. I'm going to save that for when I get back from my holiday. Instead, what we're doing is we're going through 12 Rules for Life, giving a general impression of it. So that basically, because I got a bunch of messages from people saying, really loved your video on it, can't send it to my dad because you're naked and dressed as Satan. So will you do something a little more chill? And when I come back from my holiday at the end of April, beginning of May, then we'll do a comment reply stream and we'll look at all the fan art and we'll talk about how the last episode went and everything. So this is a little bit of something new. Okay, so rule number 5 we're on to now. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them, and buckle up, because this is a chapter about parenting. We get a little bit more about order and chaos. Again, vague, not really explored. There's a whole page here that could probably have been edited out. He talks about you got to raise your parent. You got to raise your kids in the right way, because there's all sorts of people who are encouraging you to throw out traditions and throw out the stabilizing traditions in order to fit in more and more smaller and smaller groups of people, and that's not a good thing. So he says, don't throw out the stabilizing traditions. And at the top, I've written stabilizing for who? So for some people, the traditional roles of society are destabilizing. So again, it's about like who gets to decide what order is and what is chaos, because it's not really kind of given what those are. There's some bits here that I've written white nationalists cheer. He says, altering our ways of social being carelessly in the name of some ideological shibboleth, diversity springs to mind, is likely to produce far more trouble than good. And a white nationalist is going to read that and go, yeah. I'm curious about whether that's something that you want when you're writing a book. Maybe it is. He also says, the 1960s, a decade whose excesses led to a general denigration of adulthood, an unthinking disbelief in the existence of competent power, and the inability to distinguish between the chaos of immaturity and responsible freedom. And I've written in the margin, that's how you sum up the 1960s? That's your summary of the 60s. Not, an area of civil rights or of struggle or of massive protest against imperialist war. That's what you want to go for? Interesting. Here we get into here's where I had a bit of a revelation moment. Peterson says that Rousseau, the philosopher Rousseau, his idea of the noble savage in the state of nature is essentially the same as the divine child. And I've written, what does it mean to say that Rousseau's state of nature and Jesus are both instances of the archetype of the divine child? What does that mean? Is there some kind of objectively existing archetype and these are both linked to somehow? Or are you just saying, I think these are similar? And this is what I was trying to get at with the video, is that he uses a lot of objective sounding language when really what it sounds like he's doing is saying, I think these two things go together. And it's like, okay, cool. But when you say it like that, it just sounds like somebody writing their opinion. But when you put it in language like this, it sounds like they've sort of divined this and it's written in the heavens and only the high priest can read it. But actually, it seems more like somebody just kind of writing an opinion piece. There we go. He says you got to raise your kids in the right way. Parents have to take responsibility. You can't just write everything off to social structures. It is not just wrong to attribute all the violent tendencies of human beings to the pathologies of social structure. It's wrong enough to be virtually backward. And I've written in the margin, who does that? Who says that? Who says that parenting plays absolutely no role? And then it's all socially... Who? Anyone? Citation? No? Moving on. Doodly doodly doo, bloogie bloogie blue, take responsibility for your kids. He says that his son wasn't behaving himself as a baby, and as a joke I've written, maybe instead of blaming others you should ask if it's really your fault. We get some stuff about how he used to work on the railroad and he had a nickname. Oh no, that comes later. Oh yeah, so here's some stuff about if you reward people when they do the things that you want them to, you can get them to kind of do what you want more often. And he's kind of saying, when your kids do something good, reward them. If they do something bad, withhold the reward. He talks about how he wanted his daughter to be more communicative with him. So when she was communicative, he rewarded her. When she wasn't, he didn't. Just put a pin in that. Put a pin in that. His goal was, I want my daughter to be more communicative. We'll come back to it. Page 136, we hear that Occam's razor, the scientist's conceptual guillotine, states that the simplest possible hypothesis is preferable. It doesn't say that. That's not what Occam's razor says, and it's not a scientific principle. It's a philosophical one. That's just me being pedantic, but it's a common mistake. And then he says you can hit your kids. Yeah, that's the conclusion. Is sometimes you got to hit your kids. I'm being harsh, but he does say sometimes you can a swat across the backside can be what a responsible adult needs to do. So Peterson concludes you've got to be responsible, you've got to be a parent, you've got to bring your kids up right. Sometimes that means smacking them. There is no examination of the literature, of the science, of studies, anything about what the impact of corporal punishment is on kids either way. He doesn't say sometimes you've got to hit your kids. Here's the evidence that proves that kids turn out right. Or you've got to hit your kids and this is why the evidence that says it doesn't turn out right is bad. There's no... He's making this point which has big empirical implications, but there is no... He doesn't seem curious about the evidence on this question at all. There's just no mention of it, which is odd and a little frustrating. So I said put a pin in earlier on the fact that the goal he wanted was, I want my daughter to be more communicative, and he talks about how you can get what you want out of your kids. It's interesting that he frames that in terms of, I want my daughter to do what I want, rather than I want my daughter's emotional needs to be fulfilled. And I'm absolutely not, I would never question somebody's, parenting skills, especially not from a book like this where you don't get the right impression from it at all. But that's the example he gives, that when he's talking about rewarding parents and so on, and he generalizes it to people generally, the framing of it is like, you can get what you want from this, rather than you can enter into communication relationships where you both get what you need. It's just interesting that he frames it as competitive like that. And the framing, in fact, presumes that better than somebody else what their needs are and what's good for them. Which maybe in some cases, like parenting, is true, but is it true in all? He doesn't seem to be curious about that. Anyway, we come to rule number 6. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. Interesting one. We get a few pages on why nihilism is bad, and apparently it leads to mass killings, although, again, as I said in the video, if it was just that, we'd expect mass killings for everybody, but... Anyway. Oh yeah, here's an interesting point. He briefly mentions Karl Panzram, who was a murderer of the 20th century, who Peterson says he had a very hard upbringing, he was brutalized, and he became resentful, he hated everybody around him, and then he killed people. And then he says, his destructiveness was aimed in some fundamental manner at God himself. And I've written how above that, because this is something that Peterson does a couple of times, and we'll come back to it. He says people are doing this thing, that people really believe this. He was directing this at God. It's like, how do you know that? Did you read his diary? Do you know? In fact, and this is a good time to bring up that sometimes some of the claims that Peterson makes are very clearly literal. He's saying this is the literal truth. Some of the things he says are clearly metaphorical. And then, there's a bit later on where he describes Medusa as he's got octopus as Medusa, very clearly poetic, because octopuses aren't serpents, they're mollusks, right? But there's a lot of stuff that's in between that's kind of like, do you mean this literally, or do you mean it poetically? Because if you mean it literally, you need to back it up. And it seems like he's just sort of waiting for you to go, do you have any evidence for that? And he'll go, I meant it poetically. I'm not saying that's what he's doing, but it would be very convenient. The book is structured in such a way that he can very easily retreat into that. So when he's saying, this murderer, Karl Panzram, his fury was directed at God himself, do you mean that literally? In which case, let's have the evidence. And if you don't, then what are you really saying? What is it a metaphor for? And I think that you can say, oh, he didn't mean it literally, he means it as a metaphor, but that doesn't automatically mean that all metaphors are equally good or have the same effect. Although they're immune to criticism, you know? People criticize poems all the time. So just because he's writing poetically doesn't mean I think that you get off the hook for that. Like, if it's a metaphor, okay, why'd you choose that one? What are you trying to evoke with that metaphor? So we'll come back to that, because it comes up a fair bit. But anyway, don't be a nihilist, it's very bad and you'll murder people. Okay, here's a fun bit. We get to talk about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who I've probably mispronounced. Solzhenitsyn wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago, which was an account of his time in the gulags in Soviet Russia. I have a copy of it, although I've not read it yet. Peterson's a big fan of this book. The edition I have, Peterson actually wrote the foreword. Peterson says, this is the book that proves that communism is evil and that it's just fundamentally bad. And Solzhenitsyn wrote this book, The Gulag Archipelago, criticizing communism and says it's very, very bad. Put a pin in that. Just put a pin in it. Peterson goes on to say, don't criticize the world, don't criticize being before you've really thought about whether it's you. Maybe you're the problem. Maybe you need to change how you do things. Fair enough. Sometimes good advice. Sometimes. And then the chapter concludes. And the curiosity I have is, some people say, he's saying that some people are criticizing being. They're raging against God himself. They're like trying to criticize the whole world instead of thinking, actually, maybe it's just me. But why is Solzhenitsyn an example of somebody not doing that? It's because it seems like you could take that and apply it to him. Why is Solzhenitsyn an example of a man doing just criticism of an unjust system and not an example of somebody railing against being and against God? Because it seems like he... Why is that different? Why is it different? And the answer is, of course, that it's different because Peterson hates communism. But I'm curious about that double standard, you know? Anyway, we move on to rule number 7. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. The first line of this chapter is, life is suffering. And I've written there's a big difference between life is suffering and life inevitably features some suffering, which is a big logical distinction. Kind of harkens back to the earlier point about him naturalizing hierarchies and reifying hierarchies. But okay, life is suffering. There's some fairly wishy-washy arguments against hedonism here, like life is suffering and therefore don't be a hedonist, which actually, the fact that life inevitably contains some suffering isn't actually an argument against being a hedonist. In fact, I would say if life is suffering, then we should all be hedonists, because do your best to avoid it. It kind of makes it a high priority, but whatever. There's some stuff about how work and delaying gratification is very important. There's a big kind of metaphysical thing that's important in the world. Fair enough, Peterson on that edge game. Everyone asks these questions all the time, even if they don't notice. Again, brilliant, completely unfalsifiable. Everyone's always asking themselves, how can I super chat Olly? But nobody realizes they're asking that. Like you can say that about anything, right? totally applicable to everything. But okay, turn of phrase. Literary turn of phrase, fair enough. We go on. He talks a little bit about his ideas of maps of meaning and how these very ancient ideas are being set down in unconscious rules. Again, not a lot of citation for that. Or is it not literal? Is this a claim about human evolution and minds, or is this something else? In which case, what? It's kind of detail that I'm missing in this chapter, really. I mean, there's a lot of material, but it's a very kind of ooh, and I'd like a bit more. I realise that's an odd basis of comparison, but I've written at the top of page 174. This chapter is the waffliest yet. There's some repetition of stuff that came earlier, which we don't need to dwell on. Some more quotations from Milton. Theology 101 with Reverend Peterson I've written here. Oh yeah, okay, cool. Here's an interesting quote. It is not only that men desire power so they will no longer suffer. It is not only that they desire power so they can overcome subjugation to want, disease, and death. Power may also mean the capacity to take vengeance, ensure submission, and crush enemies. So people don't just want to be powerful to be free of want. People have a dark desire to hurt others. And I've written, okay, interesting. But again, what does it mean to make that claim about somebody's mind? You're saying people believe this thing. What does it mean to make that claim without asking them what they believe? Without citing them, without asking, like, people really believe this, and 99 out of 100 people I asked said that it was true. So you see what I mean? It's like, this is a hypothesis. People really believe this about power. People really want this. Or it seems like a hypothesis, but there's no evidence for it. And if it's not a hypothesis and it's more of a poetic claim, then like, what is the content of it? Or is it just you saying, I think this? In which case, okay, like, well, great. Like, why should I believe it, you know? Yeah. Here we have some very interesting bits about how the hierarchical slave-based societies of our ancestors reorganized themselves under the sway of an ethical religious revelation. So he's saying that Christianity persuaded people to give up slavery, and I've written the slave rebellions helped underneath. So yeah, he says like Christianity was this big ethical religious revelation moment. People got rid of slavery, people changed society, and it was different forever. But Christianity was also used to justify slavery, which he doesn't touch on. So I've written here, where is your citation of slavery historians? And again, if this is a claim about history, if you're claiming people gave up slavery because of Christianity, is that an empirical claim? In which case, let's hear from the historians. Or are you saying something else? In which case, what? What do you mean? What do you mean, man? This chapter's a little bit all over the place. There's a lot of stuff about Christ. Yeah, more stuff about Christ. Again, there's he says here that a lot of people who are socialists are really just resentful of people who are rich. And I was like, ooh, okay, interesting to reflect on. Again, empirical claim or not? Have you asked them? And also, if that's true, does it matter? He doesn't say. But life is suffering, apparently. Satan's in it. Meaning signifies that you're balanced between order and chaos. So again, if order and chaos are just kind of arbitrary creations of Peterson's mind, then the whole thing sort of falls down. I've written this chapter is the vaguest one yet. It really is, and there's not a lot else I can say about it. Right, let's do Rule 8, and then we'll take a bit of a water break. Rule 8 is tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Again, a lot of stories about his early life. A lot of stuff about that. So he's saying, yeah, stand up and tell the truth. Oh, okay. So let me see if am I remembering this chapter right? No, maybe not. Let's keep going through it. Yeah. So tell the truth. It's very important. I've written, this is as good a time to ask, since we can't always tell all truths, how do we decide which ones to tell? Doesn't seem to be curious about that. We get a lot of side swipes here at communism. Alexander Solzhenitsyn comes back. He says communism was only popular with intellectuals in Russia, because they were arrogant, and the workers wasn't really attractive so much to oppressed workers, which is again, is that a historical claim? In which case, I'm sorry, that's not true. The workers took part in the revolution, rightly or wrongly, they did. And again, he doesn't really consider the idea that people have made this point before, that communism and socialism does often have a strong intellectual sort of class element behind it. He doesn't really consider the possibility that maybe that's because like people have a lot more time on their hands to consider stuff and read old theories and so on. But all right. He says that totalitarianism is completely reducible to deceit, which Again, what's the nature of that claim? Kind of seems like a bit of an oversimplification. We need to rely on traditions. Which ones? How we decide that? He doesn't say. We need to rejuvenate the state. I've written what? Kind of comes out of nowhere. Culture is always in a near-dead state, even though it was established by the spirit of great people in the past. And I've written, was it? Was culture established by great people in the past, or is culture what we have that was good at getting copied? Again, there's this idea that things that are old must have value, rather than things that are old have managed to survive this long, partly through luck. A lot of historical texts and indeed buildings, as we've learned tragically recently, are around because of luck rather than value. But there we go. Sorry, I got an itchy nose. Oh yeah, here we go again. A totalitarian never asks, what if my current ambition is in error? And I've written, don't they? Citation needed. Like, if you're saying Stalin never asked, might I be wrong? Did you have a camera in his head? Have you read his diary? Like, what are you saying? What are you really saying there? I don't know. He says you should tell the truth because you know your needs better than anyone else. You'd stand up and speak about what you think you need, and once you've done the work and you've figured it out, you stand up and say it. And it seems that he doesn't really extend that courtesy. Okay. It would be very, very easy for me to sit here and say Peterson doesn't follow his own advice. Okay, because you can make anyone out to be a hypocrite. Because maybe sometimes he doesn't follow his own advice because he's human like all of us. That doesn't mean it's not good advice. But here I think it is relevant because he says, don't childishly believe that there's someone else who knows you better than you. You know your needs. You know what you think. Once you've figured out and you've done the work, stand up and tell the truth. And that's not a courtesy he extends to trans people at all. It's like in his political work and in his public life, he's not following his own advice there, not just in a personal way, but he's actually denying other people the possibility of even doing that. So that's a shame. Again, we get life is suffering, but he doesn't seem curious about the distinction between life is suffering and life inevitably features some suffering. Without attention, culture denigrates and dies, and evil prevails. And I've written in the margin, quite. He says, so, speak up, tell the truth. He doesn't seem to be curious about what happens if people's individual truths conflict. Which seems to be like the most salient point here, but fair enough. I've written in my notes to Chapter 8, many of these rules for life support contradictory actions. But I think that's probably, in fairness to Peterson, more of a feature of self-help than a bug. It's probably because, you have to write things that are fairly abstract for everyone. So, all right. He does advise people that your values will naturally change over time, and you should be open to the idea that your values will change. Although I think we could have got there without all the Christianity and the Toryism, but fair enough. And here's an interesting point about how Peterson uses the word ideology. He seems to be using it to mean a set of ideas that does not change, which I think is a weird way of using the word ideology. Because if you were to talk about left-wing ideology and mean by that left-wing ideas don't change, there's centuries and centuries, centuries of Marxist critique and people revising left-wing ideas. Even within Stalinist Russia, there was some discussion about how ideas should be constructed and like variation. So, how fixed and ossified does something have to be in Peterson's mind before it becomes an ideology? It seems like he's using the word ideology in a very limited way to avoid saying that he's got one. It seems that way. Fair. Maybe I'm missing the point. But all right. We're an hour in, and we've done 8 of the rules. We've got 4 to go. Let's have a drink. 4 to go in the conclusion. Trans rights, says the chat. Woof. Nice. Hockey dokie. Let me find us some music, and we'll go into the final bit. We'll go into the final stretch. Okie dokie. Are we ready? Are we ready to crack on? Alright, where are we? We want to get to chapter 9. I think we should be able to move through the rest of these fairly swiftly. Okie dokie. Chapter 9. Assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. Pretty good advice. Pretty good advice generally in the abstract. Okay, so here, trigger warning, I'm afraid here for sexual assault. Here, Peterson talks about, in his work as a clinical psychologist, a woman came into a session one day, and she said that she thought she'd been raped 5 times, and Peterson has this moment in the text where he reflects on the quite interesting fact that a psychologist or a therapist has a degree of control, I guess, as a way to influence what people think about what's happened to them. That if your therapist tells you, "I think it's this," they're an authority figure. Maybe you take that and you can construct something together. And there's some quite interesting reflection. Like he reflects on, he's got to do. He gets to kind of, in a way, decide what happened to this woman. And there's a responsibility that comes with that, which is pretty interesting. And he talks about how memory isn't an objective thing. Memory is a tool. It's about like figuring out what you're going to do in the future. It's a tool for figuring that out, rather than an objective record of everything. So he reflects on he's in this position of responsibility where he gets to help this woman decide what happens, and that's actually quite interesting. He could have told her, "Yes, this happened to you. You're absolutely right. You need to report it," or he could have told her, "Pull your socks up. It's your own fault." Instead, he says he decided to listen to her. There's some unfortunate choice of language here surrounding that particular topic. There's some verbose chat about thinking. There's some bits here where he says, if you say something that takes everyone aback, you should reconsider what you said. You need good, even great reasons to ignore or defy general public opinion. And I've written in the margins, and yet you continue to post. But fair enough. There's an interesting bit where he says that Freud put patients on a couch because he didn't want them to face him, and he didn't want his own emotional reactions to kind of to affect what they said. You didn't want them to be censoring themselves, I guess, which is interesting. I'd always wondered about the Freudian couch thing, but that's cool. That's cool. That was interesting. He says at the bottom here, you can be pretty smart if you just shut up. And again, I've written, and yet you continue to post. Harsh. So yeah, he's saying sometimes you got to sit down and listen to people. And I've written at the top here, in fairness, the fact that Jordan Peterson doesn't follow this advice doesn't mean it's not good advice. There's all this stuff about like different ways of having conversations. Sometimes people aren't really having conversations to genuinely listen and to watch out for those. Sometimes people are just kind of posing, and fair enough. He talks about this one friend who he used to have who told like really cool, edgy jokes. And then he says, I've found that such conversations occurred less and less frequently as I moved from university to university. And in the spirit of the previous 8 chapters, I've written in the margins, maybe it's secretly your fault. Maybe you're a buzzkill. Which would seem to be consistent with his earlier advice, but is flippant, I'll grant you. And I've written at the bottom here, what is the point of this list of conversations? We get a lot of reminiscing about his early life. I'm curious about why that's in there. Again, he talks about... in order to have a respectful conversation with somebody, you need to assume that they've reached careful, thoughtful, genuine conclusions, and maybe you're wrong. He says, to have a proper conversation and communicate with somebody, you got to risk the idea that you might be wrong, which is fair. And I've written at the bottom, why don't you extend this courtesy to trans people? But my notes on chapter 9 say the first half of this is actually pretty interesting. I don't get the feeling that he follows this advice, but that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't good advice. So chapter 9, one of my faves. One of my faves so far. Chapter 10, be precise in your speech. This one, deceptively simple. I actually kind of like this one. Maybe this is my favourite chapter. When he says be precise in your speech, he's really talking about how don't let things go unsaid. You know, if there's something you want, if you need to communicate with somebody, don't leave it, because you know it can fester and it can become something big over time. Sometimes he says, you know, there are conversations that are difficult to have, especially if it's like, you know, maybe a conversation with your partner, like, you've hurt me or I'm unsatisfied with this. Those can be difficult. But he's saying, you know, when you figure out what you want, say it. Always better to get it over with now than to let it build and build and build. Which, fair enough. Pretty good advice that I've used before. There's some more kind of Toryism in terms of the examples. And I've written here at the top here, in fairness, communicating despite difficulties or anxieties is decent advice. There's a strange poem here. I've written, verbosity is getting away from you. So, and I've written at the bottom here, and this is something I touched on in the video. He says, you know, be precise in your speech. Say what you want. And it's interesting that the example he gives of that is an interpersonal relationship of like a husband and wife. You know, don't let things fester. If there's something not right, say it. He gives the example he uses as an interpersonal relationship rather than say what you want politically. Be honest about that. Be precise in your political speech. Not so much. Not keen on that. Interesting. So actually, this reminded me of an old Geordie story called the Lampton Worm. It's an old Geordie song called the Lampton Worm, actually. About a guy called John Lampton who goes fishing in the River Wear, and he finds this little, he fishes out this little weird eel thing, and he's like, I don't know what this is, and he throws it into a well, and then he goes off and he joins the Crusades for many, many years, and he comes back and he finds that in his own hometown there's this massive like dragon that's so huge it coils around the local mountain 7 times. It's like drinking. Sorry, I just got a nice message. It's drinking all the local sheep and cows dry of all their milk, and it's, you know, swallowing up children and so on. And he finds out, oh God, the legendary Lampton Worm, the big dragon, it's that little eel thing that he chucked in the well, right? And he, you know, he ignored the problem, and it grew and it grew. And the kind of moral of the story is don't let that happen to you. Sorry, let me just take a quick break here to message someone. Yay, I'm just on stream. I'll message you in a bit. Sorry, this is my life interfering in Jordan Peterson time. Okay. Yeah. So the story of the Lampton Worm. Don't let small things build. And it seems to me that, you know, that's kind of what Peterson's saying here. It's just sort of the story of the Lampton Worm, but repackaged with Christian imagery and this sort of order and chaos metaphysics on top of it. But it's still not bad advice. Then we get to this really interesting one. Rule number 11. Do not bother children when they are skateboarding. Interesting one. Oh my gosh. Thank you to Kathy Guyton for that super chat. I said earlier on that I was going to try. I probably wasn't going to shout out many super chats, but that's incredibly generous. Thank you very much. This isn't typical of my streams. I'm just doing something a little bit different. So yeah, rule number 11: do not bother children when they are skateboarding. Let me just flip to my my notes at the end here. Oh yeah! Oh my gosh! Chapter 11 is where it really goes off the rails. So I mentioned at the start that Norman Doidge's foreword to this book kind of gives a bad impression of it. It's like it's all about like, you know, like don't be a moral relativist and stuff. And it's weird that Doidge thinks that this book is big, like challenge to relativism. And here's where it all comes in. This is the chapter where he's like, postmodernism, it's destroying the West and all the rest of it. He doesn't quite say that, but yeah. Don't bother children when they're skateboarding. Is the idea. This is where we get all the stuff about postmodernism as evil, that it's a secret message from my mum and dad, that it's a secret plot to kind of hide Marxism. But here we get some great stuff about don't do identity politics, because any group identity can be fragmented right down to the level of the individual. Like race, you can race is kind of a made up category, so like we shouldn't even be organizing around the backs of it, which to me strikes me as kind of pedantry. It's perhaps ungenerous, but yeah, there we go. This is all the stuff I was that Cuck philosophy and Nat will tell you about endlessly, that Peterson gets postmodernism backwards and doesn't really understand it, or Marxism, which more talented YouTubers than me have talked about before. He says sometimes good men invent things, like men invented menstrual products, and therefore patriarchy is not a thing. Were they part of the patriarchy? And it's like, do you think it's about intention? Which is interesting. Doodly doo. Yeah, get married, traditional marriage. Yeah, don't be a communist. Chapter 11 is the kind of the really wild stuff. But here's the thing. He says, don't try and step on other people. Don't try and control what other people are doing. Don't and especially don't try and do it and pretend that you care about them. Don't try and stop children from skateboarding and say, oh, it's about your safety, when what you really want is just for them not to have fun, right? And it seems to me you could flip that on its head and be like, well, why are you stopping trans people from skateboarding? Why are you stopping leftists from skateboarding? And saying, oh, it's really about your well-being, or it's really about societal well-being. It seems like this advice could be completely flipped around. So, I mean, to be fair, the same is true of a lot of self-help rules. But it seems particularly egregious in this case. This is the most political chapter, definitely. Extremely political. So, yeah, take that for what you will. But anyway, then we get into the final rule, chapter 12. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street, which really doesn't need much saying about it, because it's just stop and smell the roses. Take pleasure in the little things in life. Life sucks sometimes, but sometimes you get a nice little bonus. And you can sometimes you see a cat in the street and you can pet it. There's also some good advice here that if there's something you're really worrying about, if there's something that's really difficult, set aside some specific time to worry about it. And this is a technique that I actually got through therapy as well, called worry postponement technique. If there's something you're really anxious about, something my therapist told me is, say, I'm going to worry about this at 10 a.m. tomorrow. I'm not going to worry about it now. 10 a.m. tomorrow is when I'm going to worry about it. It's like, okay, cool. And that I found that actually worked with me, because usually when it got to 10 a.m. the next day, I was like, I'm not really bothered about that after all. So there's a little bit of stuff here that's kind of similar to that, which is, stop and smell the roses. And my only note on chapter 12 was, this was actually quite nice. So, yeah, chapter 12, not a bad one. Not a bad one to go out on. Big contrast to, big contrast to 11, which was just like, oh my gosh, don't be a postmodernist. Yeah, that was weird. He's spoken too much, got paranoid. Okay, and then finally we get into the coda, the kind of outro, which is mainly just a summary of all the things that have gone before, and therefore all the big contradictions that we've gone over so far re-emerge. Like, reification, making things sound objective when really is just being subjective. This kind of problem of what are you really saying? Is it a literal claim or not? Speak honestly to people and assume that they risk something in a conversation, which is pretty reasonable advice, although again, unless you're trans, obviously. Sometimes things go wrong. Stop and smell the roses. There's some kind of like a lot of books, the outro broadens it out and says, but maybe I'm wrong. Okay, so I don't want to be patronizing here. I definitely want to try and avoid doing that. The outro, the coda to the book makes me a little sad. Some people say that Peterson's a grifter, that he's just kind of in it for a scam, and if he is, it's a very good scam. Because having read the book and having read the outro, he seems very sincere. He seems like he really cares about this. That he genuinely is trying to do good and to help people. And he says, and I, at various points throughout the book I've written, this is you. Like, you were saying this is bad, this is you. Here at the top of page 367, he says, Rule 6 is to fix yourself before you try and fix the world, right? Anything else is presumptuous. Anything else risks harm stemming from your ignorance and lack of skill. And I've written, yeah, like, that's what you've done. That's what you've done, man. Rule 6, fix yourself before you try and fix the world, contradicts the existence of this whole book, the whole project. There's a bit earlier on where he talks about here we go. There's a bit in chapter 11, the wild one, where he talks about gender, and he talks about alluding to trans people. It says, gender is constructed, but an individual who desires gender reassignment surgery is to be unarguably considered a man trapped in a woman's body, or vice versa. The fact that both of these cannot logically be true simultaneously is just ignored, which is a classic turf move, saying, oh, like, if gender's socially constructed, then, like, why are you saying, like, really one thing or the other? Which, it's just ignoring the social and socially constructed. It's viewing constructed as, like, arbitrary or empty, when really that's not what it means. And he doesn't cite anyone. He doesn't cite any trans people. He doesn't cite, like, Julie Serrano or Talia Beccia or anyone at all. He's just like, this is what it is, and fuck you. And it's like, yeah, anything else risks harm stemming from your ignorance and lack of skill. You haven't followed your own rule there. You've not set yourself in order first. And it's a shame reading this coda, because I get it's hard not to get a sense of the man behind the words. And it feels like he genuinely wants to help. And some of the advice in this book, abstracted away from the kind of Toryism, is pretty good. Like, listen to other people, emotional literacy, don't leave things small now that get big later. Fair enough. Good advice. And it's a shame that it goes so wrong, in my opinion. And I've written here at the bottom, as I was deciding what kind of video I wanted to make, the fact that he seems to take it seriously made me want to take it seriously too. So although I made this very jokey, irreverent video, I did try and approach the arguments in a serious spirit, rather than just, dunk on him. And that's the book. Do I recommend it? I'm afraid not. The stuff that's good, you can get elsewhere, and the stuff that's bad is pretty bad. So sorry, Peterson fans, but nobody can accuse me of taking him out of context, because I read the lot. Whew! If you've got a beer, crack it. Smoke them if you got them. We did it. We did it, gang. We got to the end. All 12 rules for life. Whew, man. I need a holiday. So, on Friday I'm going on holiday. I'm gonna have a damn good time. And when I get back, then we'll do a stream talking about the Devil episode and all of the stuff about that. We'll look at some of the fan art. We'll have a really fun time. Cool chat. Nice. I think my flatmates are back now, and I'm making a bit of noise, so I'll probably stop the stream. But yeah, we did it. Made it all the way through, and now there's a version, like, you've got my thoughts on 12 Rules for Life, that if you want to pass them on to people without a sort of sexy, devil person, then you can. All right, and I need to make a call as well. So I'm going to enjoy that holiday. All right, everybody, take it easy. Have a great night. Thanks for tuning out. Thank you to all the super chats again. Amazingly generous. Real nice. So, take her easy.